is now spring of 1945, and the Wehrmacht is imploding. You have the Red Army knocking on the door of Berlin up on the Seelau Heights. You have the Allies who've got across the Rhine, and they're pushing forward very vigorously straight into the heart of Germany. The German army is suffering, and what is approaching the arena is what we call a Kampfgruppe. And what that means, it's a battle group. At the core of it are Panzer Grenadiers from the 304th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, and they are under instructions to move forward. There is an asset up ahead. There is a Hetzer tank hunter. The German army is very, very short of armour. This Hetzer has become separated with the parent unit, and the Panzer Grenadiers of this unit are tasked with supporting and assisting the recovery of this Hetzer. The vehicle you can see in front of you, the lead vehicle is an SDK-2T2. The correct name for that is a Leichter Panzersparwagen. That is a reconnaissance vehicle, so it's a pre-war design. Used quite successfully in the desert. It's a recce vehicle. It's designed to have good cross-country capabilities. It's armed with 10 Panzer Grenadiers in the back, and you can see they are dismounting, debussing. Panzer Grenadier is a World War II German concept. Originally these guys are just mechanised infantry, but infantry-tank cooperation has always been incredibly important. Marshal Chuikov said, if you can separate tanks and infantry, both suffer. So the German army came up with elite infantry, Panzer Grenadier, who were designed specifically to operate with tanks and were mounted in vehicles like the 251. You can also see there's a truck, a heavy mover come in, pulling a Pak 38 anti-tank gun. And this is a pre-war design. It's a 50mm weapon. It's probably not up to dealing with heavy armour, but it's still a potent weapon, and it's useful against soft-skin vehicles. Now the problem with the Pak is, as you can see by those guys having to lose a lot of muscle power to move into position, is it needs to be towed into place, and then when it's in place, it's actually quite vulnerable. Unless you can hit the enemy first, he's going to be dropping mortar rounds around you, and the crew will suffer, because there's, apart from that shield on the front, there's no armour protection. Nevertheless, it is a useful weapon. You can get it in place, you can get it cammed up, and it's got very low profile, so they've been lucky to be able to score some hits on enemy tanks before they can see you. So it looks as though the Kampfgruppe commander has decided to fight rearguard action. He is low on ammunition, his vehicles are low on fuel, and this is his last throw of the dice. But he has been tasked with the recovery, the support of this Hetzer, and he's going to carry that job out. A Kampfgruppe is a bit of a hodgepodge organisation. They were formed out of whatever units are available. So you've got the Panzer Grenadieren from the 304th Regiment, you've got anti-tank gunners, and then you've got the vehicle crews in the 222s. The truck, the heavy mover, is pushing down out of line. He's going to try it on. No, the chappie has thought better of it. He's coming under fire, and he is pulling back to await reinforcements. This problem, and you can see entering from the left-hand side of the arena, we have a Sherman. A bit later on in the afternoon, you'll hear quite a lot more about the Sherman, but this is the most prolifically produced tank of World War II, with the exception of the Russian T-34. Over 50,000 Shermans were produced, and it is armed with 75mm gun. They were popular with their crews, they were reliable, but they were prey to the German heavy armour. If a Sherman came up against something like a Tiger, those of you who've seen the Fury will know what happens. But the two tanks are coming through. The Chaffee has pulled round to assist the Sherman. The Sherman's moving round, they're reversing turrets round towards the German position. The Chaffee's firing. Return fire coming from the Panzer Grenadiers. If you're in one of these vehicles, you hear the rounds pinging off the outside. Sherman is pulling round. He is getting into a firing position. Sherman's firing. Chaffee's pulling round. There are rounds dropping in amongst the defenders. Still firing. The Chaffee and the Sherman are now awaiting reinforcements. You might think this would be easy, but for a tank to take on an infantry and anti-tank position is extremely difficult. They're going to need to wait until extra armour is pulled forward and also extra infantry. Tank-infantry cooperation is absolutely vital. Oh, SDK 222 is pulling forward. He has decided to take on the Chaffee. That is a very brave thing to do with a 2-centimetre gun. He's firing on the Chaffee and the Sherman. But that's essentially a very light armoured vehicle. That's just about a suicidal move on his part. But the Panzer Grenadier are coming forward. The pack is firing. The Allied army is retreating. There's a counter-attack going on. Lots of rounds cracking across the battlefield. We can only think that reinforcements are on their way. And here they are. Another part of the formation is moving forward. There is another Sherman. And behind that is a very familiar vehicle to anyone who knows anything about US Army in World War II. It's an M16 half-track armed with a quad 50 cal machine gun. Now this is a ferocious weapon. It was designed as a light anti-aircraft gun to discourage low-flying aircraft. Used against ground targets, you can imagine the impact of 4 50 caliber machine guns. It got nicknamed the meat chopper from the effect that it had on positions. Sherman is firing. The other 222 is trying his luck. He's moved up into a firing position. He's looking. G42 is firing. American coming up. 222 has been knocked out, and US infantry are deployed on the ground. They have bazookas and they're running forward to pick up a mortar as well. Infantry moving forward, deploying foreign movement. Heavy weight of fire down on the German defenders. Has scored a hit on the SDK 251, knocked that vehicle out. So we've got 2 German vehicles, both knocked out. Panzer Grenadiers are realising that the tide is turning against them. They are starting to withdraw back one strategic band. There's still the Hetzer to take care of. but there's a weight of fire dropping down on the German position. The US infantry are getting close enough not just to use rifles, but to use Thompson submachine gun, short range weapon. Putting up a stiff fight. They are returning fire. US troops are now dropping mortar rounds down around Pack 38. Pack 38, as I said, its crew is going to be very vulnerable to small arms and mortar fire. Background has decided that discretion is the better part of valor. He's pulling back. Allied troops moving in. Panzer Grenadier retreating, taking casualties. The US Army is winning the firefight. The armour is moving forward. Moving in to finish things off. This is where infantry come into the road. Troops on the ground to take enemy Lots of fire going on. Both the 222 have been knocked out, the pack has been knocked out, and the Hetzer is retreating. Now the Greyhound and the M16 are moving. Panzer Grenadier are attempting to fight a retreat, but I think they've been penned into a corner. Effectively their formation has ceased to exist, lost all its vehicles. US infantry moving in to take prisoners and to secure the position. You can see the Panzer Grenadiers, they have put up a very stiff fight. The guys who are, many of them wounded, short of ammunition.
Continual lack of materiel for the German army. Most German soldiers went to war on their own 2 feet. Most German logistics relied upon horses to pull wagons rather than motorised transport. So what we're seeing now is really, in essence, the reason why D-Day was successful, the reason why the Second World War came to the conclusion that it did. We're looking here at the result of the Allies putting things completely on a war footing. Before America entered the Second World War, they were building thousands of domestic cars a year. When they entered the Second World War, they built a little less than 150 in a single year. The rest of their production went on producing things like the Jeep you can see here, like the weapons carrier that you saw earlier on. Now, what I'll do is I'll just give a name check the vehicles they come past. We're kicking off here with the Willis Jeep, an iconic vehicle from the Second World War. Somewhere in the region of 640,000 built. The Germans would have given their eye teeth for that kind of production. The German Wagon, the German Jeep, if you like, they could never get their hands on. They never had enough. The Dodge weapons carrier, we saw that in action. We also saw that 50 caliber on the back of it, very, very important. Morris armoured car. Interesting vehicle, really harks back to the beaches of Dunkirk as much as it does to the beaches of Normandy, but we'll cover that when he comes round again. Here's our look-alike pair. As you can see, little and large as it were. We've got the Daimler Dingo in the front and we've got the Ford Lynx coming up behind. The Daimler armoured car, and that's been followed up by the M8 armoured car, the Greyhound. Interestingly enough, Chris mentioned that the British were not that impressed by the Greyhound, and the reason they weren't was the Daimler in front of it. The Daimler did the same job, did it rather better. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is the M26 Pacific Dragon Wagon. That is a beast. It's an armoured recovery vehicle, and I'll say a bit more about that again when we get the chance. Here's one of my particular favourites, the Beat Chopper. They could be reused. The Germans were never in a position to do that. Therefore, get back to what we're saying about logistical power. There goes the Beat Chopper. Very, very useful after D-Day, particularly in that close blockage country in Normandy. And the M1A1 Sherman. More about that a bit later on. I'll explain, for instance, why the Sherman's called a Sherman. The argument being that Churchill didn't like all these M1s, A1s and what have you, so he insisted they be given names. That particular version there, as I say, was the first one that was used by the British and Alamein, but continued to be used throughout the war. And in fact, if you hang on for our Sherman talk, you'll notice one of the more modern Shermans in many concepts.
So the M50s and M51s, it's kind of okay to refer to them as Super Shermans. I'm not going to get into trouble.
No, why not? They're all gun Shermans from World War II.
And I know we've got to dash up in a second or two, but you brought it down from Yorkshire, where you've got a museum. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, we come from Eden Camp. We're a World War II prison, in fact, so we've come quite a distance. But the main aim for the restoration has always been to take part at Tankfest, so we're very pleased to be here.
Wonderful, and we'll see the Sherman story after we've seen the World War II armour, and David Willey is in the centre of the arena now.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're now on to some of the nicer pieces, I'd imagine, that you think in our collection. This one, starting off, Second World War classic German tank. This is the Panzer III. Tim mentioned earlier, Germany, that's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, 5 centimetre opening. They also come up for the Panzer IV, a 7.5 centimetre gun that fires high explosives, so rounds that will have blast effect, so they'd be great for firing in infantry positions, buildings, anti-tank guns. They're the Panzer IVs to help the infantry advance. They're like support tanks. And then these tanks, the Panzer IIIs, should go through the gap that has been created. And they're perhaps akin to the British idea of a cruiser tank, a faster tank to exploit the gap. They start with a 37mm gun, the standard anti-tank gun the Germans are towing around behind their vehicles. That's put on, but the interesting thing with the German tanks, as often commented on, is the fact that they can be upgraded in service. They've got a large turret ring, and that means you can fit larger guns as they come into service. Now, this particular Panzer III, it's the Model L. The Germans, they have a system, so as you go through each improvement, it becomes a new Ausrung, A, B, C, D, and you give a letter to each one that's going through that improvement. This is an L model Panzer III, and it's even more special in the sense that it's got that new 5 centimetre gun. It's got extra armour plate put on the front, because again, the British in particular, when this is fighting, it's British troops and Commonwealth troops is fighting against, we're getting new 6-pounder anti-tank guns into service. You're going to need more armour protection. Can you see that was also tropicalised? It's got extra filters to try and suck out more of the dust before it gets in and ruins your engine. Now, we know this vehicle was sent out to Libya. It's reported the Germans were very good at keeping records of all the chassis numbers when they came into the port. We've got photographs after it's captured and it's being debombed in the port of Benghazi. In other words, they're taking all the ammunition out to make it safe to ship back to Britain, where it's taken to Chertsey, just off the M3, just where they called it the tank factory in World War II. School of Tank Technology does all the analysis. So this is one of a number of captured German tanks from North Africa. You can actually see battle damage on it. We're not 100% certain where exactly it was captured at the time, but it's one that we learned lessons from. When I finished doing the analysis, they didn't always put them back together properly. So we've got some tanks with engine decks that obviously came from a different vehicle, but being placed on top of another vehicle, just to make everybody happy, as it were. So that's our L model Panzer III. It's been a runner at the museum for many, many years. It's now back in the colours that it was captured in. This Dunkelgelb, as it was called, the colour that the Germans painted an awful lot of their vehicles, sometimes putting a camouflage scheme on the top, but it seemed to be a colour they pick on that they think will work not just for North Africa but the Northwest Europe campaign as well. Now, we're very lucky here. We've had over the last few years on loan to us this particular tank. It's called a Hargo, and it's being a Japanese tank from the Second World War. It's being followed on by an M3 Stuart tank, and these are two tanks that fought against each other out in the Far East. The Hargo, privately owned, it was taken back to Japan from a Polynesian island. It had been left behind. Basically, the Americans did, they bypassed the island. After the war, some of them were taken to Japan, some of them were scrapped. This particular one sat on the island for many, many years, ended up in Japan, then came to Europe, has been restored mainly in Poland. Tourists for making some of the crews sick because of the way it rocks back and forward. Again, from the crew's point of view, it was lined with asbestos. Those were the days we thought asbestos was great for everything, kept the heat down and acted as a bit of padding. Subsequently, that of course had to be removed from this vehicle. 37mm gun, it would fire high explosive or armour piercing, not that powerful, but it was good enough for most of the enemies the Hargo fought against. In the Far East, there is with other countries and tanks at this time of the war. Now, following on behind it, this M3 Stuart tank. We've talked already about the Americans in the interwar period. They try to hang on the whole to they spend their money on their defence and aeroplane engine, and unfortunately that makes it quite high as a vehicle. So the height of the vehicle is because basically the drive shaft comes out the middle and runs all the way through to those sprocketed wheels at the front of the vehicle. The downside of the M3 was that aircraft engine is ridiculously thirsty. You could go 75 miles in a Stuart before you ran out of petrol, and that's only half the distance of, say, the British Crusader tanks that they're fighting with out in the Western Desert. Hence called, they don't want to call it the M4, it sounds all very confusing, this M3, M4, because they know it'll get confused with the M4 Sherman, so they call the next version the M5. And it has a new engine in the back, thicker armour, all the sorts of things we see happening to tanks in World War II. This guns versus armour race, you need more protection and you need more firepower to get through the enemy's armour. Now, real rarity here, another one of those wonderful privately owned vehicles restored from an absolute wreck of a hull, found in the basement of one of the factories that made it. This is a Valentine tank. There's pots, whopping great flotation tanks on the side, but then he goes for this idea of let's put a canvas screen up, displace the water, we'll float ashore. The downside for the Valentine, look at that gun, it's over the front of the tank, though they decide for D-Day we're going to convert Sherman tanks, doing the same system, screen up the sides, but the Sherman gun is much shorter, so it can face forward. As soon as the screen drops, they can start firing at the enemy positions. And you can see our Sherman DDs inside the museum with the screen up. Now, the Valentine is an important tank for Britain. We make over 8,000 of them in the war. It's a tank we make the most of. It was originally designed to replace Matilda II as what was called an infantry tank. It was to support the infantry attacking prepared positions. Thick armour on the front, relatively slow, that didn't matter, but we were so short as we set the plans out. We want the Americans to build these, in the end we get the Canadians to build these as well. And 2,000 Valentines are made in Canada, most of which are gifted to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease arrangements, keeping the Russian army going. Now, just before D-Day, down not far from here in Studland Harbour, down there, 6 of them sunk, 6 guys' lives were lost. And the British learned the lesson: if the sea is rough, take your tanks as close to the shore as you dare before launching them on D-Day. The whole principle was, if one landing craft with all the tanks on gets hit and sunk, how are they going to support the infantry? If we spread those tanks out. So if you go down to Studland Harbour, there's a lovely little memorial there to the guys who lost their lives above that beautiful beach on Studland Harbour. And like the guy from the National Trust who runs it, he says so many people go there and they don't know what happened on that beach. The one reason Studland, by the way, it's got a lovely nature reserve behind, and that's because it's full of shells that they used to launch in, lots of blinds as they're called, rounds that haven't gone off. They're all in the dunes there, so they thought they won't go and develop any of that, they'll leave well alone. Now, classic Sherman coming on. This particular Sherman, we'll talk about them a little bit more later on. This one's got a bit of a longer hull, and it's got something called a Chrysler multi-bank engine in. I said earlier about radial engines, aeroplane ones. The American industries are making as many engines as they can. Aeroplanes have the priority. So planes first, they're going to be the ones doing the advances. But what happens when enemy tanks come the other way? What are we going to do about that? So they've got towed anti-tank guns, which you can take to where you think the enemy are coming. But the Americans come up with the idea of the tank destroyer. And they create, under a Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, a new unit based at Fort Hood. It's going to become Tank Destroyer Command, and they make speedier vehicles with thin armour to carry an anti-tank gun. And the idea is, if there's an enemy breakthrough of tanks, you rush your tank destroyers there and ambush the enemy. Now, it sounded good in theory, in practice it didn't quite work. Now, this particular vehicle, they start with GMT half-tracks, not dissimilar to our M16. You put your anti-tank gun on top of that. They then move on to something called the M10. They get a Sherman running gear, thin armour plate, and a big gun on the top. That becomes the M10. This is a later model. They wanted speed. 9 cars, it's Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, really keen to get a fast vehicle. And that's what they've done with this M18, what was known as the Hellcat. It's got a radial engine, so again another aeroplane engine in the back. The R975, the same engine that's in some of the Shermans. It's got very thin armour. It's about ½ inch thick. It'll stop a bullet, but not much else. In charge. Patton says it doesn't really work in Tunisia. The word goes back, we're not too sure this is a way of doing things. Because the idea you can get your right type of vehicle in the right place at the right time is questioned. Is it better to not just have well-armed tanks all over the place to deal with enemy tanks should they advance? So they stopped making the Hellcat very early in its production run. They were going to make a lot of them. They only make about 2,000, which sounds a lot, but it's nowhere near the 8,000 they'd originally planned. 55 miles an hour, this Hellcat. They managed to race ahead, get to the crossroad of the village, and stop the Germans capturing it. So they do have their moments in the war, but it's often been discussed as heroes are some of those tanks that America supplied to Yugoslavia. This Hellcat went there as well, and it ended up being seeing action later in the fighting. When Yugoslavia fought apart in the 1980s, and if you you get the chance, go and have a look at it, because you can actually see, talk to the owner, you can see the hole in the front when it was knocked out. They've still got, and you can also see there that another one of those classics from the Second World War. Just before the Second World War, the Russians start putting a heavy tank into production, the KV-1. There's a rival tank factory, and a guy called Mikhail Koshkin has come up with his design for a relatively heavy tank for the Red Army. The Red Army aren't that bothered about it at the time. Stalin gets wind of it, likes the design, and says to the Red Army, "You're going to want this, aren't you?" And of course the Red Army immediately turns around and says, "Absolutely, it's the best thing since sliced bread." So this goes into service just in 1940-41. The first ones are being issued to the Red Army. The problem for the Red Army at the time, Stalin has killed 30,000 of their officer class. They are decimated in terms of their leadership, just when, in the summer of 41, the Germans invade. Now, that T-34, the original ones went into action with a smaller gun, 76mm gun. This is one that was built in response of penetrating the German armour. So the T-34 goes into production from later in 43, and it sees out the Russian army to the end of the war. Lots and lots made, estimates around 70,000 of them. It's also the most knocked out tank in World War II because they suffer enormous losses at the hands of German anti-tank gunners, Panzerfaust, etc. These are used by the Russians almost like in the West we might use a hand grenade. If you need 20 of them to get through to the next village, don't worry, we've got another 20 waiting for you that we'll issue later on, so that they see a huge attritional rate, very rough on the crews, but they work. It's a very simple design, simplified during its production. And if you look at one of these to an early war one, lots of bits are left off it. There's times some of these left the factory without even a seat for the driver. They had to move the factories back behind the Ural Mountains. And as part of that, they realised there's things on some tanks that aren't really needed in combat. As long as it lasts for about 2 months, it's done its job. And you can see that very crude. This particular one we think was made after the war in Poland. They carried on making them in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and amazingly enough, there's photos of a T-34-85 still in use on making this Chaffee tank. This particular one, privately owned, again it's here, it's in British markings. It's been marked up as Bill Bellamy's tank. Bill Bellamy wrote a wonderful memoir of his wartime experiences. 1945, he's issued with one of the first Lend-Lease Chaffies that goes across to British forces, and that's what this one looks like. Stock of these tanks, they leave some in Europe and they're redistributed. So you've got Chaffies are seeing service out in Vietnam, in all sorts around the world, because again they're smaller, lighter, and that of course goes down very well, especially if you're in a country that doesn't have much in the way of infrastructure. You don't want too many roads being chewed up. Now down the far end, that tank, the engine from the Lancaster bomber, he gets crash versions of that and starts converting them to make up an engine derating that will fit in a tank. And ultimately that becomes what's called the Meteor. And by the middle of the war we're able to start building those. We're less worried about being invaded. We can start making these engines to go in tanks. So they go in the Cromwell, and they make that tank so ridiculously fast it will shake the tank apart unless you derate the engine. And we also put it into this tank, the next version, family Comet. That engine gives this vehicle speed and power, about 600 horsepower, that Meteor engine. And this is also a tank that has now got the new British 77mm high velocity gun.
But you will see the second one that comes out is the one that I was talking to Frank about earlier, which is their special M50 in blue, and I'll tell you more about that a bit later. But now we're going to hand over to Tim Broad and Stuart Wheeler.
Thanks, Steve. Right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, the Sherman story. We've seen a little bit about the Sherman. We've heard a bit about it. I've suggested to you it is possibly the most important tank in the Second World War. And we're going to have a slightly closer look at one or two of them. Now, David mentioned to you that the name Sherman came about largely, or allegedly at least, because Churchill found it difficult to deal with all these alphanumeric designations that the Americans were giving to their tanks. And bearing in mind, for instance, there were two M3s, one big one, one little one at the same time. So I can understand to an extent what he's talking about. When America entered the Second World War, just about, it's a good example, just about every sizable engineering company started to produce tanks. They started to produce Shermans, and the designation of the Sherman depends very much on the power pack that's in the back. Now, in the order which they're coming round at the moment, we've seen the M1A1, that was the cast one, that rounded hull that we saw earlier on. This is the M4A2, this is our famous Fury tank. It's being followed up by the M4A4, and then the M50 and the M51. Which looks a bit like an E8, so that's how Fury became Fury. And that 76mm gun was very effective. It wouldn't penetrate the frontal armour of a Panzer about 1.5 together around a single drive shaft. 30 cylinders around a single drive shaft. It sounds complicated, and it was. The Americans didn't like it because of the maintenance. The British, on the other hand, were quite pleased. They quite liked it. It is the basis of the British Firefly. The gun you see there on Bell is the standard 75. It's a kind of medium velocity 75mm gun. Not quite up to the job when it comes to dealing with these heavier German tanks. The British shoehorned a 70-pounder anti-tank gun into it, and we ended up then with a Sherman capable of taking on, for instance, a Tiger. It would have been slightly more realistic, I think, had Fury been a Firefly rather than an Easy 8. So, you can also notice, if you're really nerdy, you may have noticed.
Thank you, Tim. What we're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is the M50 just moving off. That's in the blue paint scheme of the Southern Lebanese Army circa 1982. It was donated by the Israeli Army. If we go back to the 1940s, 1948 to 1949, Israel are fighting a war of independence to establish their state, and they're being attacked by the Arab nations that are around them. And basically, they have about 40 tanks, about 30 of those tanks are Shermans. What they realise is that after the war, that basically they need to concentrate on one type of vehicle, and they look at the Sherman because they're obsolete, they're fairly easy to get hold of, and they're pretty cheap. They also know that they haven't got much in the terms of base repair, so what they have to do is, the logistics, the Algerians in the French-Algerian War, and so they decide to help the Israelis. And what they do is they take basically they look to put that in the Sherman. And what they do is, when this is an M4A4, if they take the turret, take the rear part off of the turret and re-weld it, and they'd have built 200 of those, by the way. When they came to the end of building those and fought them during the 1956 Arab-Israeli war, they realised that they needed another gun, an even bigger gun. So basically, they decided to take the M4A1 hulls, the T-23 turret, and they looked to the French again, and this is in the early 1960s, and they take the 105mm gun that's on the AMX-30. They basically reduce it down in size, the length, by 1.5 metres. They put a double baffle muzzle brake on it, and basically they take the rear of the turret off and extend it again. They put lead at the back of the turret, like the M50, to make sure that the gun is balanced when it's gyro stabilised the round, so it doesn't spin too much when it actually hits the target. Otherwise, the shape of the charge won't work. So that's what they do. And stop spinning against the target. You can see this one as well has a HVSS suspension. It needed that because the engine was sort of overworked at this level. Because to put that turret on there, you had to go up by 7 tons. So it goes from a 32-ton Sherman to a 39-ton Sherman. But that suspension makes it a lot easier. They also added things like grenade launchers, also a searchlight on the front would have been in most platoons, they'd have had one of those, and you get the 50 cal on there. But you can see that was being used to combat the T-54s, T-55s and IS-3s.
light tank. Can we get it in a plane? Could we airdrop it with parachutes if we had to? Now the Scorpion, some of the older blokes in the audience, you may remember if you had that as the Action Man tank. It breeds a whole family of vehicles with the same engine, same track, same transmission, that is called Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked, CVRT. And we will see in a while, one of those families still in service to this day with the British Army. This vehicle, very lightweight, very low ground pressure. Ground pressure beneath the tracks of a Scorpion is less than the ground pressure beneath your feet. And famously in the Falklands campaign, one of the commanders jumped off the side of his vehicle, tank absolutely fine, sitting on a ammunition tanks, armour piercing, by firing a heat round that would make a scab fly off inside the enemy tank, smoke shells, even canister rounds. End of the 40s, start a programme. Again, they're interested in getting back in the marketplace for military vehicles. Again, like Britain, they want to rebuild their economies after the Second World War. So they start with the AMX-13 tank, and it goes into service in the early 1950s. They go around trying to get buyers to buy into this programme, including the Swiss, the AMX-13 has an interesting turret on it. It's what they call an oscillating turret. The gun is kept in a fixed position that goes up and down with the roof of that vehicle on a pivot. And the idea there, whole point is you can exit to that roof and it has cassettes of 6 rounds that can be fired off. So once you've fired those 12 rounds, you pretty much have to go off the battlefield to reload. But it was very successful. The MX-13, as we see over there, manufactured and sold to Switzerland in 1955. Switzerland had been neutral in World War II. It had realised at the end of the Second World War, its war plan was if it ever got invaded, retreat up into the mountains. They then realised that would mean leaving most of their population behind them on this flat plain. So they knew they were and they wanted tanks to do that. Part of the arrangement of getting those tanks, the Swiss come to Britain and they asked to buy the British Centurion tank. We've just started building those at the end of World War II. They don't see service in the Second World War. We upgrade them. We now have a 20-pounder gun on the famous Centurion. The Swiss think this is a really good tank to buy. Then so we have to wait 5 more years before we can sell these to Switzerland. That one's got some modifications and it later had an upgrade. They all end up with this 105 gun we'll talk about. Switzerland was worried we couldn't buy the Centurion. They bought some of those units left in the world that can still put a tank into service. Now with the Swiss, they go for this British 105mm gun, really important gun. They build it under license. They learn about casting, because this is a cast metal turret, cast metal hull. But one thing they couldn't build in Switzerland at the time in quantity was so they import these exclusively a Mercedes bunker in. People sometimes wonder why at the same time, perhaps even to the same battlefield, the different countries build very different looking tanks. And for the Swiss, one of the reasons this tank, if you look at it from the front, it's slightly narrower than most other tanks. And that's for a very sensible reason, because in Swiss mountain roads, the last thing you want is something too big and too wide and heavy. for mobility instead. Now we've got a couple of tanks out today that look like those Soviet era with a frying pan shaped turret, this very distinctive design. After the war, the Soviets put into production their T-54 tank, then very quickly a slightly improved model, the T-55, and they make, the estimate is almost 90,000 of them overall. Probably the most numerous tank of all time. This one is actually a Chinese copy. 1956, China and Russia, both communist countries, they hadn't been getting on, they do a pact. And as part of the pact, Russia gives China the plans for building T-54 tanks, and it helps them set up factories to build tanks for the first time in China. And when you copy a T-54 tank in China, it becomes what's known as a type tank. So I hope you're making notes here, Type 59 is a Chinese copy of the T-54 tank. And helpfully we've written that on the side. So these were exported all around the world by China, and they also, this particular one, very confusing, it's got a British gun on because Royal Ordnance in Britain offered. Now this Whopper coming round now, this is the American, what was called the M60 tank, but its story actually begins really with World War II. What was called the M26, the Pershing vehicle, they took that vehicle, improved on it just after World War II, and made the M47 and then the M48 tanks, which is basically evolutionary developments. Congress, the Senate argue about it, and they end up going for the M60 instead. Simpler vehicle, building on the experience before, and yet again, that famous, which is the best thing since sliced bread, it can fire a round that will penetrate most of the known Russian tanks. Got nervous, 1956, they drove the T-54 inside the British Museum. Greece has them, Turkey has them, so like many tanks, they don't tend to go away, they just get moved on for further use in another country. Now that very distinctive engine note here, you can hear the L60, the British Leyland engine running, now I say it's the British lessons from the Second World War. The British designers of the Chieftains, most of them had seen service in World War II. Their attitude was, we are never in Britain going to have a underprotected tank compared to the enemies again. Hence Chieftain has the thickest armour of any tank of its time, and we want firepower. And this was one of the tanks Chieftain was designed to fight against. This is the Soviet era T72. This particular one was actually made in Poland. They were also made in Czechoslovakia, and a number of other countries were given licenses to build them. Exposed should you be penetrated. you're looking at a skin of a tank there. Underneath it, that's where the armour packs are that hold this still officially top secret Chobham armour. I could tell you what's in it, but then I'd have to kill you all afterwards. They still guard that.
In the back there, so it's a kind of armour personnel carrier, but it also mounts on the top that medium velocity 76mm gun that we saw.
Is a gunnery instructor down the road at Lulworth. That's where they teach them all to fire the weaponry that's on all these in-service British Army vehicles. And I'm here to ask Chris some questions about what we're going to be seeing coming on, what these vehicles are, what their role is. And there you go, that one's so quiet I couldn't see it again, a bit like Tim. What's this fellow then?
Okay, this is the Jackal, used for light reconnaissance as now modern battles. We're not looking for visual signatures, we're looking for thermal signatures.
And obviously this is fairly nippy and speedy and very mobile cross-country.
It certainly is. It can push out to technically 80 miles an hour, although I've had rumours that it's gone faster, but that would be against the rules.
And the whole idea is deep reconnaissance. Okay, and another vehicle, I mentioned this earlier, this is part of that family. When we saw the Scorpion light tank earlier on, CBRT, this is one of the families still in service to this day.
It is, yeah. We've retired the CBRT Scimitar this year for the Brigade Reconnaissance units. The Royal Engineers still use the Spartan for engineering, reconnaissance, etc.
Of room, because the youngster in there is learning how to drive. So one of the things about Spartan, that speed it's got, that turner speed, I know you're not allowed to comment on that, but some of these vehicles were actually giving some of the CVR's fleet is going off to Ukraine, I believe, so it is.
Yeah, that's quite important now. We've moved away from reconnaissance for stealth, which you can't harm in thermal imager. So we're just going to start using this vehicle entry, now the Warrior, for reconnaissance and the reconnaissance units.
So originally FE 510 entered service as the Warrior, as an armoured personnel carrier. We'll see it in operation in a moment in the battle, taking a section of infantry in the back. And as you say, the interesting thing, it was due to come out of service. It's all right, he did stop there. Due to come out of service in about
to stop at the length of the vehicle. That's great for when you're carrying out an assault and you need to stop right in position.
That's a 30mm rod cannon. That's getting old a bit, isn't it? It's still quite effective.
Yeah, it's getting on a bit, but actually it's an incredibly accurate weapon system. And it's more than capable of dealing with our near adversaries.
You can see us standing here slightly nervously as the driver shows off. We've actually had the guy actually managed to drift a Warrior around the corner in front of everybody a couple of years ago. So, and it just shows the control and the power. And he says with much more confidence afterwards again. So it's that idea of how do we detect roadside bombs and counter them, and that's why you'll see it the same again on vehicles like the Mastiff. And nowadays, of course, you have cameras everywhere as well.
Yeah, situational awareness is massively important, especially when we're fighting in open areas. As you see on the vehicles, there's a full 360 awareness going on using the cameras. It's also good in the Mastiff, which is slightly better than the Warrior when it comes to this type of stuff, because the dismounts in the back have access to the camera system. So as it's moving towards an objective, the crew in the back, the dismounts who are going to be attacking the objective, can see what they're going into before we get there.
And can we explain that idea of sacrificial parts? So the wheels might go, some of the stowage bins might go, but then you take the vehicle back, rebuild it quite quickly. The key thing is the crew's safe inside.
Yeah, I mean, you see the fuel tanks are sacrificial as well. So when an ID goes off, it blows the fuel tanks away from the vehicle, so you've got less chance of having to be rolling around the floor for a little bit, and you think, we're getting shot at. With acoustic detectors, we can get rid of that problem.
Okay, now part of the Challenger family, this is the Titan bricklayer, and again, I'll just let you listen to the engine note of this one. hot exhaust and it creates an instant smoke screen. It's one of the other ways you can fire smoke dischargers with smoke grenades, or you can do that, and obviously that helps hide you from the enemy. You can't see the vehicle, you can redeploy. Hopefully their rounds will miss you if they're firing at you. So the current British Army's tank, this is Challenger 2 coming on, and this particular Challenger 2 Theatre Entry Standard, or TES, it's got all the extra bells and whistles added to it, as it would have if it goes away to fight.
I think they're having a competition how much smoke they both produce.
So what we're looking at there again, you've got your Barracuda system, that camouflage netting to try and hide the heat signature of the vehicle to a degree. 120mm gun, still a powerful weapon even if it's getting a bit old.
Yeah, it is getting on a bit, but it's still very competent. Dealing with most our threats. Unfortunately, it's going to get replaced with the Challenger 3.
Now, as that turret's circulating around, can you explain that hunter-killer system, what the commander's doing and what the gunner's doing in there?
So the hunter-killer system works on the ability for the commander to input data of the fire control system using his own independent sight. So it means he'll cue a gunner up onto a target, the gunner will continue engaging that target, and the commander can then scan around and look for a second target, laze it, put the information into the computer, so once the first target's been destroyed, he can instantly engage the second target. It makes it much more efficient than just individual targets.
And the other one that modern tanks have,
And that's just because not the accuracy, it's the ability to kill the target reliably at 2,000 meters, not hit it.
same system of mobility kill? In other words, you can disable a vehicle, or do you say is it K kill?
From the 1970s, of course you can't teach you. One of the best tank guns in the world. It also opens up to the international market of ammunition, so we're not constrained to British-only rifled ammunition we can buy from America, France, Germany, etc. So it makes procurement a lot simpler and a lot cheaper.
And also there we're looking at, it hasn't been formally announced, but things like hard kill, soft kill, these new defensive aids. Soft kill fires electronic pulses to disrupt missiles, hard kill fires something solid out to try and disrupt incoming ground to protect the vehicles.
Yeah, hard kill systems are the future of armoured warfare. Will turn this anti-tank missile threat such as Javelin and NLAWs on its head and make them virtually useless.
Now this is the recovery version.
The recce mechs are not a bunch, but yeah, they love getting money.
And the crane on the back for engine changes.
Yeah, it's a little mobile workshop we have on there, so it's a pretty good asset.
Sales and Development Unit that's based here at Bovington. Their role, why they have all this equipment here, is basically if there's any new upgrade to an armoured vehicle, these are the guys that have to test it, try and break it, see if it fits on the vehicle, doesn't interfere with what's going on. And they're crewing today down here some of the vehicles that we'll be showing, and they're going to put those vehicles together for us. So if you're not about to dash off, hang on here, because they're going to show you some of these vehicles.
Hello,
Across the friendly forces, starting with the reconnaissance call signs.
hello, Zero. This is Echo 1-1 Golf. A bridge is set and crossing is now open. Over. Zero, I'm Roger.
Now that the gap has been crossed, we're going to move on to the next phase of the operation. Entering the arena now is the Jackal. This reconnaissance platform will race ahead of the rest of the battle group to create something called the reconnaissance gap. This means a gap of approximately 5 kilometers between the reconnaissance vehicles and the lead elements of the battle group. This gap creates breathing space, allowing the battle group commander to formulate a plan after the sighting. The Jackal will use its superior speed and stealth to get a position of overwatch on potential enemy positions. If an enemy is spotted, then a sighting report will be sent to the battle group commander.
Hello, Zero, this is Whiskey 21 Alpha at sighting at 17 to 1 hours at Red Sierra Uniform at 370575. A one-time T-72 static on track. I'm observing. Over.
From here, the battle group commander will take the information from the reconnaissance call signs and formulate a plan. In this example, a deliberate attack. The plan will be disseminated across the battle group so all platforms understand their mission and their part to play. When H hour arrives, the battle group commander orders the attack. dismount and carry out a section attack with the warrior acting as fire support. Once the enemy position has been cleared, the infantry call signs can either remount the warrior or push onto an in-depth position. In this case, they can withdraw back to the warrior. We'll now carry out a number of laps in the arena for photo opportunities. If you're interested in any of the vehicles or roles you've seen today, please search Army Jobs for more information.
Thank you very much indeed to Staff Sergeant Chris McLaren, who's been up there in the commentary box, and of course the whole of the team who put on a fantastic display to round off your day. Don't forget.